A 13-year-old girl, cast out of her home for becoming pregnant, returns years later to shock everyone. Lila's father, Gregory, thundered, "You've got nothing else to say, Lila?" His voice shook the stifling air of their small home. The 13-year-old flinched, unable to meet her father's fiery gaze. Her hands trembled as they gripped the hem of her worn-out t-shirt. Her head bowed low in a futile attempt to disappear. Shame, raw and suffocating, choked her as her mother, Evelyn, spat out venomous words, her face void of even the faintest sympathy. "Pregnant? At your age," Evelyn hissed, her disdain piercing Lila like a blade. "God help me. What did I do to deserve a daughter like you?" I didn't mean for this to happen," Lila stammered, her words dissolving into sobs. Tears cascaded down her cheeks, but there was no comfort to be found in that room. "Didn't mean to?" Gregory roared, his fist slamming against the table with enough force to rattle the walls. "Do you have any idea how much shame you've brought to this family? What will the neighbors say? How are we supposed to live in this town now?" Evelyn let out a cold, mocking laugh. "Gregory, why even bother reasoning with her? A girl like that doesn't deserve to stay here. Let her deal with the consequences herself." No, Mom. Please," Lila begged, finally lifting her tear-streaked face to meet her mother's icy glare. But all she received in return was cold indifference. "What are you still doing on your knees?" Gregory barked, rising abruptly. He pointed to the door. "Get out of this house, now." The world beneath Lila's feet crumbled. Her breaths came in panicked gasps as she stumbled backward. I have nowhere to go. I don't know what to do." "That's not our problem," Gregory said, his voice devoid of compassion. He turned away, as if Lila was already a stranger. "You're right, Gregory," Evelyn added, her tone calm but dripping with disdain. "Keeping her here will only tarnish the family name." Outside, curious neighbors had begun to gather, their whispers and pointed stares forming an oppressive cloud of judgment. Each gaze felt like a dagger in Lila's back. "Go!" Gregory roared impatiently, slamming the door behind her. Lila fled, the weight of her parents' rejection pressing down on her as heavy raindrops started to fall. The icy rain soaked through her clothes as she wandered aimlessly down the darkened streets, her bare feet squelching in the muddy ground. Desperate for shelter, she approached the door of an abandoned house. An older man with a rough face appeared, blocking her way. "Get lost. You can't stay here." "I just need one night," Lila pleaded, her voice shaking. "Please." "No trouble," he said flatly before slamming the door in her face, leaving her drenched and alone. Lila kept moving, the cold gnawing at her as she stumbled into a nearby park. Stone benches, slick with rain, offered her only refuge. Exhaustion pulled at her small frame, and she curled up on one, clutching her abdomen protectively, as if her embrace alone could shield the fragile life within her. "Hey, girl!" A harsh voice sliced through the darkness, followed by cruel laughter. Lila turned, her heart racing as three shadowy figures emerged, their faces twisted with malice. "What's a little thing like you doing out here alone?" one sneered, stepping closer. "We were looking for some fun, and look who just fell into our laps." Lila backed away, her feet unsteady on the rain-slick ground. Don't come any closer. Where do you think you're going?" Another lunged forward, but Lila turned and ran, her sobs drowned by the relentless downpour. Her legs burned as she sprinted, the men's taunting voices growing louder behind her. Fear drove her into a narrow alley where the darkness swallowed her, and she collapsed, shaking and gasping for air. The men didn't follow. "Why?" Lila whispered hoarsely to no one. "Why does everyone hate me?" That night, She huddled under a tree in the park, her body racked with chills as the rain refused to let up. She didn't know when exhaustion finally claimed her. In her dreams, her parents' faces loomed, but the love that once warmed their expressions had been replaced by cold disdain. "You deserve this, Lila." Evelyn's voice echoed through her mind, jolting her awake. Morning hadn't yet broken, and Lila's body ached with fever. Her lips were pale, her head swimming with the weight of despair. "Am I going to die here?" she wondered, her thoughts heavy with dread. The rain drummed on, merciless, as Lila, too weak to stand, surrendered to the unrelenting chill of the night. Everything around her began to blur. "Child, what are you doing here?" A warm yet aged voice pierced through the silence. Lila, frail and barely able to keep her eyes open, vaguely made out the figure of an elderly woman bending toward her, a large umbrella shielding them both from the relentless rain. Lila could no longer muster the strength to respond, her body collapsing into the stranger's arms. "Don't worry, little one," the woman said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll take care of you," Miriam added, her trembling hands carefully lifting Lila from the cold, wet ground. "Who are you?" Lila whispered, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. "Just an old baker," Miriam replied with a small smile, "but you can't stay here in the rain." Through the downpour, Miriam guided Lila to her modest bakery on the corner of the street. The little shop, though unassuming, radiated warmth, its air filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, a stark contrast to the storm outside. "Sit here," Miriam said, easing Lila onto a chair. "I'll get you some hot tea." She glanced at the shivering girl with compassion, her drenched clothes clinging to her trembling body. For the first time in days, after enduring relentless fear and pain, Lila felt the faint flicker of warmth, thanks to the kindness of a stranger. Yet deep within her, the wounds of the past remained raw, like a gash that refused to heal. The next morning, Lila awoke on an old wooden chair inside Miriam's bakery. Her body still ached, the fever from the previous day leaving her weak and disoriented. The scent of warm bread enveloped her, and her empty stomach growled loudly, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. "You're awake," Miriam said, appearing with a soft smile. She placed a glass of warm milk and a small loaf of bread on the table in front of Lila. "Here, drink this." Concern flickered in her eyes as she observed the pale, fragile girl. Thank you," Lila murmured, her voice faint and uncertain, her wary eyes revealing the distrust she carried. She wasn't accustomed to kindness, especially not from strangers. "Don't worry. I don't need to know what happened, but it's clear you need help," Miriam said with a calm yet caring tone. "Eat, and then rest. We'll talk later." Lila reached for the bread with trembling hands, her hunger overpowering her hesitation. But as she brought it to her lips, a lump formed in her throat, stopping her. The harsh words of her parents echoed in her mind, cutting through her fragile sense of relief. She set the bread down, silent tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong, child?" Miriam asked gently, sitting beside her. I don't deserve to eat," Lila choked out between sobs. "I'm nothing but a disgrace to my family." Miriam stayed silent for a moment, then clasped Lila's thin hands in her own. "Listen to me, dear. No one deserves to be treated the way you've been. I don't know what happened, but I know you're not a bad person, and you deserve to live." With Miriam's guidance, Lila began helping out in the small bakery. The tasks were light, but the curious and often judgmental stares of the neighborhood customers unsettled her. "Who's that girl," one woman whispered to Miriam, her voice dripping with suspicion. "She doesn't seem trustworthy. You'd better be careful. Your reputation could suffer." Miriam dismissed the comment without hesitation. "What I do is my business. If you don't like it, feel free to find another bakery." But not everyone shared Miriam's kindness. One afternoon, while Lila was cleaning tables, a man wearing a heavy coat entered the bakery. It was Mr. Cooper, the miserly owner of the grocery store nearby, notorious for his meddling and sharp tongue. "Miriam, we need to talk," Cooper said, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Lila. "What is it, Cooper?" Miriam asked, her voice even. "That girl," he said, pointing directly at Lila. "Do you even know who she is? I've heard she was thrown out of her house for something shameful. Keeping her here will only bring trouble." Lila lowered her head, her eyes welling up as the man's harsh words sliced through her like daggers. Miriam straightened, her expression icy and resolute. "Cooper, if you have nothing better to do, I suggest you leave. This girl has harmed no one. Perhaps you should focus on your own reputation." Cooper sneered. "Who would want to buy bread from a place that shelters someone like her?" He spat. "Then don't come back," Miriam said firmly, pointing to the door. Her voice was unwavering, her determination clear. She would not let anyone hurt Lila further. Still, rumors began to spread throughout the neighborhood. The pregnant girl had taken refuge in Miriam Bakery. Their whispers and scornful glances became harder to ignore with each passing day. One evening, as Lila was taking out the trash, a group of neighborhood kids cornered her. "Hey, who do you think you are living here?" demanded a boy named Damon, his face twisted in an intimidating sneer. I just want to live in peace," Lila stammered, her voice trembling as she took a step back. "Peace? Someone like you?" Damon spat. "You've already disgraced this place." He shoved her roughly and she stumbled to the ground. "That's enough!" Miriam's voice thundered from the bakery door. She rushed over, helping Lila to her feet. "If you can't behave, don't you dare come back here!" Damon sneered, his grin mocking. "Fine, but don't cry when I make sure no one buys your bread." Miriam guided Lila inside, her hands shaking with anger. "Don't pay attention to them. You've done nothing wrong." But Lila stayed silent, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't sure how much longer she could endure this. The harassment escalated so much that Miriam had to temporarily close the bakery to avoid further trouble. During this time, Lila tried desperately to find work, hoping to ease the burden on Miriam. But every door she knocked on slammed in her face. "We're not hiring," said a restaurant owner, his gaze lingering disdainfully on her rounded belly. "Please, just give me a chance," Lila pleaded. "I'll work hard." He shook his head firmly. From shop to shop, the rejections piled up. Lila began to feel like a shadow, unnoticed, unwanted. One afternoon, she returned to the bakery to find Miriam sitting by a stack of bills, her expression heavy with worry. "Are you okay?" Lila asked gently. Miriam sighed. "I don't know if I can keep the bakery open. People are threatening to stop buying if you stay here." "I'll leave," Lila said, her voice breaking with pain. "Don't be ridiculous," Miriam snapped. "You have nowhere to go. I won't let you end up on the streets again." But Lila couldn't shake the guilt. She saw the strain on Miriam, who worked tirelessly despite her age. That night, unable to sleep, she watched Miriam, her heart heavy with gratitude, but also a gnawing sense of responsibility. "I'll look for work again," Lila said the next morning. "I can't let you carry this burden alone." "You don't have to go anywhere," Miriam insisted, though the exhaustion in her voice was evident. "This is your home now." Still, Lila was determined. She left the bakery, combing through the neighborhood shops in search of a job. Her stomach tightened with every judgmental stare and dismissive comment. "Looking for work? How amusing," scoffed Carmen, the owner of a sewing shop, when Lila walked in. "We don't hire people like you. Get out before you dirty my store." Lila bit her lip to keep from crying, nodded, and left. Each step felt heavier, as if the world itself was pushing her down. That afternoon, with just a few coins she'd earned handing out flyers, she returned to the bakery. But before she could get there, she heard a commotion from the nearby market. "She stole my wallet. That pregnant girl, it's her." An older woman, her face red with anger, pointed directly at Lila. "No, I didn't take anything," Lila protested, her eyes brimming with tears. The crowd closed in, their stares sharp and accusatory. "Check her bag," one man said darkly. "No, please," Lila pleaded, clutching her bag tightly. But someone grabbed it from her weaker grip. They rummaged through her belongings but found nothing. The accuser hesitated, embarrassed. She must have hidden it somewhere else. Someone like her can't be trusted. Lila stood, frozen, trembling with rage and fear as the crowd murmured their agreement. "Leave!" the woman shouted, her voice cutting through the air. "Before I call the police!" Lila ran, tears blurring her vision. The cruelty of the world crushed her spirit with every step. Just for being different, for carrying a life inside her, it seemed the world was determined to trample her into the ground. When Lila arrived at the bakery, she found Miriam waiting for her, concern etched across her face. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" she asked gently. Lila couldn't hold back any longer. She collapsed into Miriam's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't do anything wrong, but they hate me. They treat me like garbage. I can't take it anymore," she choked out through her tears. Miriam stroked Lila's hair softly, her voice steady as she tried to soothe her. "You silly girl, you have to be strong. Don't let those people break you." But Lila only shook her head, the pain and despair lodged deep within her heart. The next day, Miriam left the bakery briefly to meet with the landlord about the overdue rent. Lila stayed behind, trying to work, but unable to shake her growing anxiety. The threats from Damon and the neighborhood boys continued to haunt her. As she wiped down the tables, the door suddenly burst open. Damon entered, flanked by two of his friends, smug and menacing. "Well, well, how's business today?" Damon sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "What do you want?" Lila asked, struggling to keep her voice calm. "What do we want?" "We're just here to check in," he replied with a smirk. "I heard old Miriam isn't around. So you're all alone, huh?" His smile widened, his eyes gleaming with cruel intent. "Please, just leave. This isn't a place for trouble," Lila said, her voice trembling. Damon laughed, loud and unkind. "Trouble? We're here to help you, but with that attitude, I'm starting to think you don't need any help at all." He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "Tell me, do you think that baby you're carrying is going to have a good life?" Terrified, Lila instinctively stepped back, her hands protectively cradling her stomach. "Leave now, or I'll call the police," she managed to say. "Go ahead," Damon taunted, his tone full of defiance. "But who do you think will believe you? A homeless girl with no family." Lila's words caught in her throat as her body trembled with fear and anger. Just then, a commanding voice rang out from the entrance. "Get out of here now!" Miriam stood in the doorway, a broom in her hand, her eyes blazing with resolve. Damon snickered, unconcerned. "Fine, but remember this, lady. Your bakery won't stay safe for long." With that, He and his friends sauntered out, leaving behind an air of unease that hung heavily in the room. Afterward, Miriam sat beside Lila, her expression full of understanding. But Lila only lowered her head, clutching her stomach as she murmured, "I don't know how to keep going." "You must, Lila," Miriam said firmly. "You're not just living for yourself anymore, you're living for that child. Don't let them win." Despite Miriam's words, Lila spent the night plagued by nightmares. The bakery, once her refuge, no longer felt like a haven. The hostility of the neighborhood had eroded the safety she once found there. The following morning, Miriam noticed Lila's growing withdrawal, the worry etched across her face. "Lila, take the day off. Stay inside," she said, kneading dough with steady hands. "I can't just sit around. I need to do something to help," Lila replied quietly, fidgeting with a cloth in her hands. But deep down, she was terrified of stepping outside, where contempt and hostility awaited her. "You foolish girl," Miriam said softly but firmly. "Don't worry about me. Take care of yourself first." Still, Lila was determined. That afternoon, she ventured out to buy a few supplies for the bakery. At the market, she encountered Evelyn, a vegetable vendor known for her nosy nature. "Well? Look who's still here," Evelyn said with a mocking grin as she noticed Lila standing awkwardly near her stall. "I just need to buy some vegetables," Lila murmured, avoiding Evelyn's gaze. "And you still have the nerve to show your face around here? I thought you'd left the neighborhood by now," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with disdain. Nearby shoppers began to take notice, their curious and judgmental stares cutting through Lila like blades. "I don't want any trouble. I just need a few things," Lila said softly, stepping back as if to shield herself from the weight of their gazes. Lila's heart ached as Evelyn's harsh words echoed in her ears. "You think you don't cause trouble?" Evelyn sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "With that belly of yours, you've brought shame to this entire neighborhood." Her words, sharp as knives, cut through the air, drawing murmurs of agreement from those around her. "Please," Lila said, her voice trembling, "I just want to live in peace." "Peace? Someone like you doesn't deserve peace," Evelyn shot back, her fury escalating. "Girls who can't behave don't get the luxury of tranquility. Now we all have to bear the shame you've brought upon us." Laughter erupted among the crowd, their mocking tones like a chorus of cruelty. Lila's face burned with humiliation as she turned and fled, each step away from their taunts heavier than the last. That night, the burden of their disdain weighed on her as she scrubbed the floors of the bakery. The sudden sound of the door slamming open startled her. 3 men entered, their expressions menacing. Lila froze, recognizing one of them instantly. Damon, the man who had harassed her before. "Where's Mrs. Miriam?" Damon demanded, his voice cold and steady. "She's not here," Lila replied, trying to keep her voice calm, though her hands trembled. Damon smirked darkly. "Good. Then we'll deal with you instead." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Do you really think you can live peacefully here? We warned you. This neighborhood doesn't want you." "Please," Lila pleaded, her voice cracking. "I just want to work. I don't want to cause any trouble." "Trouble? You are the trouble," Damon snapped, slamming his fist against the counter. Lila flinched, backing away. "Since you came here, this bakery has lost customers. People are sick of seeing you around." As his words filled the room, the other men began sweeping items off the counters. Freshly baked bread tumbled to the floor, flour and sugar spilling everywhere. "Stop! Please stop this!" Lila cried, tears streaming down her face. But Damon only laughed cruelly. "This is your warning. Leave, or it'll get worse." With that, they stormed out, leaving the bakery in ruins. Lila collapsed to the floor, her hands shaking as she picked up broken loaves and scattered ingredients. Tears blurred her vision. When Mrs. Miriam returned and saw the destruction, her face fell into a mask of horror. "What happened here?" Miriam gasped. "I can't stay here anymore, Grandma," Lila whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm only causing you problems." Miriam placed firm hands on Lila's shoulders, her eyes blazing with determination. "You're not going anywhere. We'll get through this together." But Lila knew the older woman was growing weary. The strain was etched in the lines of her face. 2 days later, Miriam received a notice from the landlord. If the overdue rent wasn't paid within a week, they would lose the bakery. Miriam tried to hide her worry, but Lila could see the sadness in her eyes. "I should leave," Lila said softly one evening. "If I go, maybe they'll leave you alone." "You're staying right here," Miriam replied sharply. "This is your home, Lila. I won't let you leave." But the guilt weighed heavily on Lila's heart. That night, as the quiet of the bakery surrounded her, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her hand rested on her growing belly, feeling the soft movement of the child within. "I have to go," she whispered. "For you, Hope. For her." The next morning, Lila woke before dawn. She packed her few belongings into a worn bag, taking care not to wake Miriam, who slept peacefully in the corner of the small room. Lila placed a note on the table, her hands shaking as she wrote, "Dear Mrs. Miriam, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me. But I can't keep being a burden to you. I hope my leaving will ease the pressure you've been under. I love you so much. Lila." Lila glanced at Miriam one last time, tears brimming in her eyes. She placed a hand on her belly. "Hope, we'll be strong," she murmured, "because no one else will help us." With a deep breath, she stepped outside and closed the door quietly behind her. Lila wandered the streets until she found a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with anonymity. No one asked questions here. It was a place where she could disappear. But with the little money she had, Lila could only afford a few nights. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress in the dimly lit room, clutching her belly. "We'll figure this out, Hope," she whispered. "I promise." Room number 3. "Don't bother me unless you've got more money to pay," snapped Dillard, the middle-aged landlady. Her tone was as sharp as the sound of the key she tossed toward Lila. The room was tiny, dark, and damp, its oppressive atmosphere matching the weight in Lila's chest. She sank onto the creaky bed, tears welling up in her eyes, as memories of Miriam and the warmth of the bakery flickered in her mind. But that life felt like another world now. All she had was herself and hope. "We'll be fine," Lila whispered, though even she couldn't believe her own words. On her first day at the boarding house, Lila ventured out in search of work. Door after door closed in her face. "We're not hiring. You're too young. We don't need any trouble." Each rejection cut into her like a familiar knife. Her swelling belly made judgment follow her everywhere, a silent condemnation she couldn't escape. By the time she returned, her spirits were frayed, her hope almost extinguished. As she approached her door, she noticed a cluster of children gathered outside, their mocking laughter slicing through the air. "Look at her belly! She's like a balloon!" one of them shouted, drawing more cruel giggles. Another chimed in, voice dripping with malice. "Her family probably kicked her out because she's bad." "Stop! You shouldn't say those things," Lila protested, trying to defend herself. But her trembling voice only fueled their laughter. That night, Curled up in the cramped, cold room, Lila clutched her belly tightly. She whispered soothing words to Hope, though she couldn't drown out the echoes of the children's taunts that replayed endlessly in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The next morning, determined to avoid anyone, Lila crept out early. But as she opened the door, Dillard was waiting, her tone laced with accusation. "Where's my money?" she demanded. I didn't take anything," Lila stammered, stepping back as fear prickled her skin. She would never steal. Never. "Then why has money gone missing from my drawer since the day you got here?" Dillard crossed her arms, her voice rising. "I swear I didn't do it," Lila pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. But Dillard dismissed her protest with a harsh glare. "Enough excuses. You have 24 hours to pay or get out. I don't need a thief in my house." Dillard's shout carried down the hallway, drawing curious stares from the other tenants. Lila lowered her head, tears streaming down her face as whispers spread around her like wildfire. The humiliation was suffocating. When she returned to her room that evening, the door was ajar. Her heart sank as she stepped inside. The few belongings she owned were scattered across the floor, her small bag of money gone. "No," she murmured, her voice breaking as fresh tears began to flow. Panicked, she ran to Dillard to explain. But before she could utter more than a word, the landlady cut her off. "You again? Don't blame others for your problems. If something happened, it's your fault," Dillard snapped, silencing Lila with a single dismissive glare. Defeated, Lila retreated to her room. Alone, in the suffocating darkness, she hugged her belly tightly, her whispers trembling with despair. "I'm sorry, Hope. I can't protect you. Where will we go now? What are we going to do?" The silence answered her, broken only by the hollow whistle of the wind seeping through the cracks in the door, a haunting reminder of just how alone she was. By morning, Lila packed what little remained into her worn bag. The jingling keys in her hand felt like a final insult as she handed them to Dillard, who barely acknowledged her before waving her off impatiently. Avoiding the icy stares of the other tenants, Lila kept her head down and walked out, the weight of the world pressing on her thin shoulders. She wandered aimlessly through streets that once felt familiar, but now seemed to reject her like everything else. Hunger clawed at her stomach, and her legs felt ready to give out. Leaning against an old brick wall, she took a shuddering breath, her thin jacket offering no protection against the biting cold. Eventually, she found herself at an old marketplace. It was a place where kind souls had occasionally handed her leftover food. But today, their gazes slid past her as if she were invisible. The bright stalls were filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread, making the pangs of hunger even harder to ignore. Gathering what little courage she had, Lila approached one of the counters. "Excuse me, would you have any leftover food?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. The woman behind the counter gave her a disdainful look, her lips curling into something between a sneer and a frown. Lila wandered the streets with a heavy heart, her shoulders slumped under the weight of rejection. "I have nothing for you. Look elsewhere," the shopkeeper had said curtly, though Lila whispered a polite, "Thank you." The words felt hollow, masking the shame bubbling inside her. She walked on, eyes fixed on the cracked pavement, avoiding the judgmental stares she could feel burning into her back. In a quiet corner of a small park, she sank onto a weathered bench, her arms instinctively cradling her growing belly. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she murmured, "Hope, I'm sorry. What did I do to deserve this? Why are we enduring so much pain?" The distant laughter of children echoed through the park, a bittersweet reminder of innocence lost. A group of kids dashed past her, their carefree giggles filling the air. One boy suddenly stopped, his curious gaze fixed on her belly. "Look at her! She's so fat!" he blurted out, and the others burst into cruel laughter. Another child picked up a small rock and tossed it in her direction. Lila didn't flinch. She merely lowered her head, her face flushed with humiliation. The world's harshness pressed in on her, tightening her chest as the tears continued to flow. By the time night fell, she was still wandering aimlessly. Eventually, she found a secluded nook between two crumbling, abandoned buildings. Curling into herself, she tried to block out the biting wind. Sleep eluded her as hunger gnawed at her stomach, and the howling wind through the cracks in the walls only deepened her despair. In the midst of this desolation, she heard footsteps in the distance. At first, she dismissed them, assuming it was just another passerby. But the steps grew louder, deliberate, until they stopped right in front of her. Startled, she lifted her tear-streaked face and found herself staring at Mrs. Miriam. The older woman's face was etched with worry and exhaustion, illuminated faintly by the beam of her flashlight. She held a battered umbrella in one hand. "Mrs. Miriam," Lila whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of surprise and guilt. "You foolish girl," Miriam scolded, her voice trembling as much as her hands. "I've been searching everywhere for you. You scared me half to death." She knelt before Lila, cupping the young woman's face gently. "Why did you run off like that?" I didn't want to be a burden to you anymore," Lila admitted, her words spilling out between sobs. Miriam pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding her as though afraid she might vanish again. "You silly child," Miriam said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You are my family. I would never leave you alone, no matter what." In the cold, empty darkness, Lila clung to Miriam. Her sobs merged with the soft patter of rain, and though they both shivered, Miriam's arms radiated a warmth Lila had thought she'd lost forever. "I've told you before, Lila," Miriam said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't have to face this alone. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Through swollen, red eyes, Lila looked at the woman who had become her anchor. "I'm so sorry for leaving without saying anything. I didn't know what else to do." "Shh," Miriam replied, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. "None of that matters. The only thing that matters is that you're safe now." That night, they huddled together under the sparse shelter of the abandoned buildings. By morning, the two returned to the small bakery that Miriam had kept alive for years. Though their troubles hadn't disappeared, the little shop now felt like a sanctuary for Lila, a true home. Lila threw herself into helping Miriam with the daily tasks. The scent of freshly baked bread once again filled the air, drawing familiar faces back to the neighborhood. Miriam watched with quiet pride as Lila, though still struggling, found her rhythm. "I'll help you with everything," Lila promised one morning, determination lighting her eyes. "We'll make it through this." Miriam smiled, the first genuine smile to grace her lips in days. "That's right, Lila. Together, nothing can bring us down." With time, Lila learned to ignore the prying eyes and whispers of the neighbors. Her focus was on her work and preparing for hope, the tiny life growing inside her. Under Miriam's guidance, the bakery regained its warmth, becoming a place of comfort for the community. "Thank you, Mrs. Miriam," Lila said one evening as they cleaned up for the day. Her voice was soft, but the gratitude in it was immense. "I couldn't have done this without you." Miriam patted her hand gently. "You're my family, Lila, and family always sticks together no matter what." Years passed, and Lila blossomed into a resilient, self-reliant woman. With Miriam by her side, she overcame challenges she once thought insurmountable. Together, they transformed the bakery into something more, a symbol of hope and perseverance. 13 years after that fateful night, Lila stood outside a cozy cafe she'd built on the outskirts of a bustling American town. The sign above the door read, "Hope," a tribute to the daughter who had become her greatest pride and joy. The past had left its scars, but under that cafe's warm roof, Lila and Miriam found peace in their quiet, hard-earned happiness. Hope, a 13-year-old girl, was a mirror of her mother, Lila, exuding intelligence and a quiet confidence that belied her age. Hope often helped her mother at the family-owned cafe, cheerfully attending to customers. Despite their modest life, it was filled with love and joy. One crisp morning, as Lila wiped down the counter, the cafe door chimed, signaling the arrival of a familiar visitor. Julia, a vibrant and lively woman in her 60s, stepped inside. An old friend of Miriam, Lila's mentor Julia, often dropped by to share stories and lend her unwavering support. "Lila, look what I found while cleaning out my attic," Julia said, her voice brimming with nostalgia. She placed a stack of old photographs on the table, her eyes twinkling. Miriam was stunning in her youth, wasn't she? Lila leaned over the counter, a warm smile softening her face as she examined the pictures. Miriam was the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. Without her, Hope and I wouldn't be here today, she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. Curious, Hope abandoned her duties and darted over to join them. "Mum, is this really Miriam? I've never seen pictures of her when she was young." Lila nodded, her expression tender as she smoothed Hope's hair. "Yes, sweetheart. She did so much for me, and for you too." Her heart swelled with gratitude for the woman who had rescued her during the darkest days of her life. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door chime. Lila looked up, her breath catching as an elderly woman hesitantly entered the cafe. Thin and frail, with snow-white hair and a face etched with deep lines, the woman carried an air of weariness and hesitation. Yet there was something in her eyes, familiar and haunting, that Lila couldn't ignore. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice quivering. The woman's lips trembled as she nodded. "Yes, Lila, it's me, your mother." The atmosphere grew heavy, the warmth of moments ago replaced by palpable tension. Julia, sensing the shift, quietly stepped back. Hope glanced between her mother and the unfamiliar woman, her young face marked with confusion. "Mom, who is she?" she asked softly. Lila inhaled sharply, her expression hardening as she spoke. "What are you doing here, Evelyn? After 13 years, you think you can just show up and pretend nothing happened?" Her voice was cold, her words cutting like glass. Evelyn lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I couldn't live with this guilt any longer. I came to ask for your forgiveness, Lila." "Forgiveness?" Lila let out a bitter laugh, tears welling in her eyes. "You threw me out without mercy. You chose your precious family's honor over your own daughter. Now, you think an apology will fix everything." Hope tugged gently at her mother's hand, her wide eyes full of uncertainty. "Mom, what's going on? Who is she?" Lila's hands trembled as she gripped the counter, her knuckles white. After a moment's pause, she turned to Hope. "She is your grandmother." "My grandmother?" Hope repeated, her voice a mix of disbelief and surprise. She turned to Evelyn. "Is it true? Are you my mum's mother? Evelyn dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her weathered face. Yes, darling. I'm your mother's mother, and I made the worst mistake of my life. I abandoned her when she needed me most. But I'm here now, hoping I can make it right. Hope stepped back, looking to Lila with confusion and hurt. Mum, is it true? Why did she leave you? Lila knelt, pulling Hope into a tight embrace. I'll tell you everything, sweetheart, but not right now. Evelyn rose shakily to her feet, her hands trembling. Lila, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'll do anything, to make amends. Lila's voice was steady but laced with pain. It won't be easy. 13 years is a long time. I rebuilt my life from nothing without you. I don't know if there's anything you can do to change that. Julia, who had been silently observing, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. Lila, what your mother did was wrong. There's no denying that. But sometimes forgiveness isn't for them. It's for us, so we can let go of the burden. Lila glanced at Julia, then back at Evelyn. Her heart was a storm of anger, sorrow, and vulnerability she wasn't ready to face. Before she could speak, Hope broke the silence. Mrs. Evelyn, Hope said firmly, her young voice steady and wise beyond her years. I don't know what you did, but if you're really sorry, you need to prove it with actions, not just words. Evelyn's tear-streaked face lit up with a faint glimmer of hope. You're absolutely right. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. She fell to her knees again, clasping Lila's hands in hers. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up, her voice trembling with sincerity. For 13 years, Evelyn had carried the weight of regret, her voice trembling as she spoke. I've lived with guilt every single day, she said through tears. Your father, he fell ill after you left. He never stopped mourning what happened, but his pride kept him from admitting it. And now, he's gone. Lila froze, as if struck by a storm. Dad's gone? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me? Why are you only here now? Evelyn clasped her daughter's hands tightly, her own trembling. I was scared, Lila. Scared you'd never forgive me. But when he passed, I realized I couldn't lose you too. You're all I have left. Lila pulled her hands away, stepping back. Her voice was sharp, laced with pain. All you have left. Do you think regret can undo what you both did? Dad threw me out, and you turned your back on me. I've raised my daughter alone for 13 years, and now you show up, expecting forgiveness just because you're lonely? Evelyn couldn't respond. She sank to her knees, shoulders shaking as she wept. Hope, Lila's teenage daughter, stood nearby, her eyes filled with uncertainty and sorrow. Mom, she whispered, her voice catching. I don't know what happened, but maybe she really wants to make things right. At that moment, the cafe door swung open, and Miriam, Lila's grandmother, walked in. She took in the scene silently before stepping forward with calm resolve. Placing a steady hand on Lila's shoulder, she said, Listen, Lila, you should hear her out. Lila turned, tears spilling over. How can I forgive her, Grandma? They threw me into hell, and now they expect me to just forget? She broke down, clinging to Miriam. Miriam held her gently but firmly. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the chains of resentment. Sometimes, forgiving someone is the greatest gift you can give yourself. Evelyn, still kneeling, spoke softly, her voice barely audible. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but please, give me a chance to make amends. I can't change the past, but I can try to be better now, for you and for Hope." Lila's emotions swirled as she gazed at her mother. "I need time," she murmured. Miriam nodded in agreement. "Of course, Lila. Take all the time you need. Just remember, no family is too broken to heal." With that, Evelyn stood, her tear-streaked face glimmering with a fragile hope. "Thank you," she said. "If you give me even the smallest chance, I'll prove to you how sorry I am." In the weeks that followed, Lila kept Evelyn at a distance, but didn't stop her from spending time with Hope. Evelyn began frequenting the cafe, sitting quietly in the corner as Lila and Hope worked. She didn't interfere but watched as Hope laughed and worked, her expressions a mixture of regret and longing. One afternoon, as Lila wiped down a table, Hope approached her, her bright eyes filled with sincerity. "Mom, I think Grandma truly regrets what she did. Can you give her a chance? I don't want to see you sad forever." Lila stared at her daughter, feeling her words chip away at the walls she had built. Hope was her reason for everything, and if forgiving Evelyn could bring peace, she couldn't ignore it. Miriam played her part as mediator, inviting Evelyn to stay for dinner or to chat after the cafe closed. One evening she said to Evelyn, "You've hurt Lila deeply, but with patience and genuine effort, I believe you can heal some of the pain." Evelyn's voice was hoarse with emotion as she replied, "I won't give up. Lila is my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to show her how much I love her." Weeks later, Lila decided it was time. She sat down with Evelyn in the cafe's small kitchen late one night, after Hope had gone to bed. Miriam, sensing the need for privacy, left them alone. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, but for the first time in years, there was also a glimmer of hope. Lila's voice remained cool, though less cutting now, as she began, "Mom, I need to know, why? Why did you turn your back on me when I needed you the most?" Evelyn lowered her gaze, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I was afraid, Lila. Your father and I were terrified of what people would think. We spent our entire lives protecting the family's reputation. When it all happened, we didn't know how to handle it. But we were wrong. So wrong." Lila stayed silent, giving Evelyn space to continue. "After you left, your father was never the same. He lived consumed by regret, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He used to sit by the window, staring out as if he were waiting for you to come back. Then why didn't you look for me?" Lila's voice cracked as she asked. "Your father believed you'd never forgive him," Evelyn confessed, "and I thought the same. But after he passed, I realized I couldn't keep living like that. I couldn't lose you, too." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Lila." Lila sat quietly, absorbing the weight of her mother's words. Memories of those difficult years flooded her mind. The cold, rainy nights she spent alone, with no one to care for her. Yet, deep down, she knew no amount of anger or pain could undo the past. "Mom," she said at last, her voice breaking, "I can't forget what happened, but for Hope, for Miriam, and for myself, I'll try to forgive." Evelyn broke down in tears and pulled Lila into a tight embrace. "Thank you, Lila. I won't let you down again." From that day on, Evelyn began working at the cafe alongside Lila. Slowly, they started to rebuild their relationship. While the scars of the past lingered, both mother and daughter put in the effort to overcome them. Hope, with her innocent questions and pure smile, became the strongest bridge connecting the two. A few months later, on a crisp, sunny morning, Hope's Cafe hosted a small event to thank the community for its support. Evelyn, Lila, Hope, and Miriam stood side by side, their faces glowing with happiness and gratitude. During her speech, Lila said, "Life is full of hardships, but if we don't give up, we'll always find hope. I want to thank Mrs. Miriam for pulling me out of my darkest days, and I want to thank my mother for choosing to fight for a second chance." With tears in her eyes, Evelyn took Lila's hand and said, "I'm so proud of you, Lila. You are the strongest woman I've ever known." The event ended with laughter and warmth. Under the humble roof of Hope's Cafe, old wounds began to heal. Together, Lila, Evelyn, Miriam, and Hope formed a family, imperfect yet overflowing with love. Lila's story carries a profound lesson about forgiveness and the transformative power of love. Forgiving isn't just about setting others free. It's about healing your own soul. In the midst of suffering and injustice, small acts of kindness, like those of Miriam, can ignite a light in even the coldest hearts, showing the way out of darkness. Life may never be perfect, but love and honesty have the power to heal even the deepest wounds. And remember, even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of hope. Wow, what a journey! This story might be fictional, but its themes and struggles are painfully real for so many young people out there. A 13-year-old girl cast out of her home for becoming pregnant, only to find strength and rebuild her life against all odds. It's a testament to resilience, love, and the power of second chances. But let's not forget, there are countless Lilas in the real world who face even harsher realities. Many young girls don't have someone like Miriam to step in when the world has abandoned them. Some end up in dangerous situations or face irreversible consequences simply because they lacked support when they needed it most. That's a heavy truth to sit with, but it's one we must face if we're going to make a difference. This story serves as a wake-up call for parents and communities. Yes, mistakes happen, but turning your back on your child in their darkest hour can have devastating effects, not just on them, but on the entire family. Instead of choosing shame or judgment, what if we chose compassion? What if we remembered that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but gives everyone a chance to heal and move forward? So, here's my takeaway. Let's be the Miriams in someone's life. Let's show kindness, stand against the crowd when it's right, and be a safe harbor for those who are struggling. And for parents watching this, ask yourself, how can you ensure your child knows they can always turn to you, no matter what? What about you? Did this story resonate with you? Do you think forgiveness is possible in situations like this? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. And remember, even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of hope.